Inspector Blackwood examined it with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a stone, turning it over in his palm, noting the intricate filigree work, the quality of the craftsmanship. Such a button, he observed to the assembled officers, was distinctive enough to be traced to its maker, and once the maker was identified, perhaps the owner could be determined. This statement hung in the air like a threat, and Miss Marple observed the subtle shifts in posture around the room. The nearly imperceptible tension that gripped several of the younger guests, particularly Christopher Weatherby, whose fingers ceased their anxious work at his waistcoat and fell suddenly still in his lap. The questioning continued through the afternoon and into the early evening, with Inspector Blackwood adopting the methodical approach of a man constructing a puzzle piece by piece. Peter Ashford, the banker's son, who had been observed paying particular attention to the banker's granddaughter, confirmed that he had been on the terrace throughout the relevant period, discussing municipal bonds with 3 witnesses who corroborated his account without hesitation. The Reverend Phelps recalled seeing Eleanor pass toward the garden path, but could not specify the precise time, his attention having been occupied by a theological discussion that had grown rather heated regarding the proper interpretation of a particular scripture. Mrs. Constance Weatherby herself, when questioned about her daughter's state of mind in recent weeks, initially maintained that Eleanor had been perfectly content, but then, with visible reluctance, admitted that the girl had seemed troubled of late, distracted as if something weighed upon her conscience. When pressed for specifics, Mrs. Weatherby became evasive, suggesting only that young women often experienced emotional turbulence that parents could not entirely comprehend, and that such matters were generally resolved through time and the steadying influence of family. It was this response that caused Miss Marple to lean forward slightly, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. She had observed Eleanor at the garden party before her death, had noted the way the girl's eyes repeatedly sought out Christopher Weatherby's face, only to look away quickly when she caught him observing her in return. She had observed, too, the subtle acknowledgement that passed between them, the kind of intimate glance that suggested not the casual affection of siblings, but something far more complicated and potentially far more dangerous. By 6 o'clock, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon and the gardens took on the peculiar golden quality of late afternoon light, Inspector Blackwood had established a preliminary timeline. Eleanor had left the tea service at approximately 4 o'clock. Thomas Hardwick had discovered the body at 4:25. The mark on her wrist and the button clutched in her hand remained mysteries, though theories were beginning to form, some more plausible than others. Several guests commented that they had observed Christopher Weatherby absent from the gathering for a period of time corresponding to Eleanor's departure and death, though none could say with certainty precisely when he had returned to the main gardens. When questioned directly about his movements, Christopher had become defensive, insisting that he had been in the library reading, that he had no idea when he had left the gathering or for how long, that such details seemed unnecessarily intrusive given the tragedy that had befallen his family. His response was precisely the kind of answer that invited suspicion, and Inspector Blackwood's expression suggested that he recognized this truth with the same clarity that Miss Marple possessed. Yet something troubled the old woman, something that did not quite align with the narrative that seemed to be constructing itself so neatly around Christopher Weatherby. She had lived too long, observed too carefully, to believe that guilt ever presented itself so conveniently. True guilt, in her experience, was far more complex, often hidden behind layers of deception so intricate that they could only be unraveled by understanding the deepest motivations that drove human behavior. She noticed that Mrs. Weatherby had not once looked at her son with accusation, despite the growing circumstantial evidence against him. Instead, she looked at him with something closer to resignation, as if she had been expecting this catastrophe all along, as if she understood something about the situation that others had not yet grasped. More significantly, Miss Marple observed that Richard Weatherby's hands trembled when he thought no one was watching, and that his eyes repeatedly moved toward the library door with an expression of profound dread. That evening, as the guests were finally dismissed and allowed to return to their homes, Inspector Blackwood established his temporary headquarters in the Manor's study, where he would spend the night reviewing statements and examining evidence. Miss Marple, before departing, was approached by the inspector himself, a courtesy extended to her because of her age and reputation for quiet wisdom. He asked, with genuine curiosity, whether she had observed anything of particular significance during the gathering. She considered the question carefully, her pale blue eyes meeting his with the directness of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to understand. She replied, quite truthfully, that she had observed very little of consequence, that the tragedy seemed to involve complications that would only reveal themselves through patient investigation. But as she walked back toward her modest cottage on the village high street, her walking stick tapping against the pavement with steady rhythm, Miss Marple's mind was already moving through possibilities, connections, and the hidden motivations that transformed an apparently simple drowning into something infinitely more sinister and deliberately concealed. The cottage that Miss Marple had occupied for nearly 40 years stood at the end of a lane bordered by hawthorn hedges, its diamond-paned windows reflecting the last amber light of the dying day. She had furnished it with the collected comfort of decades, furniture that had belonged to relatives long departed, books that had been read and reread until their spines were soft as cloth, and plants that had grown to impressive heights in terracotta pots arranged along the window sills. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, a widow of 62 who had worked for Miss Marple for the past 15 years, was waiting with tea when her employer arrived, having sensed through that peculiar intuition that long-time servants developed that the day's events would necessitate sustenance and careful conversation. They sat in the small parlor as the light faded, discussing not immediately the murder at Thornfield Manor, but rather the everyday matters that had occupied their attention before tragedy had disrupted the village's peaceful rhythms. Yet, beneath this surface conversation, ran the deeper current of Miss Marple's extraordinary mind, working through the accumulated observations of the afternoon, assembling them into patterns that others had not yet recognized. It was not until nearly 8 o'clock, when darkness had completely claimed the gardens outside and only the small circle of lamplight illuminated the parlor, that Miss Marple spoke directly of Eleanor's death. She asked Mrs. Hudson whether she had heard anything through the village grapevine that operated with greater efficiency than any official communication system regarding Eleanor Weatherby's circumstances in recent months. Mrs. Hudson, who knew the village and its inhabitants with the comprehensive knowledge of someone who had lived there her entire life, set down her teacup with deliberation. She had heard, she admitted, certain whispers regarding Eleanor and young Christopher, whispers that suggested an attachment that would not have met with parental approval, given that they were first cousins once removed, and that such relationships, while not technically forbidden, carried significant social stigma. The whispers had begun approximately 3 months prior, when Eleanor had returned from an extended stay in London, where she had supposedly been visiting elderly relatives, but where, according to village gossip, she had in fact been quietly meeting with Christopher, who had been studying at university in the same city. More troubling still, Miss Marple learned through this careful conversation, were the recent rumors that Eleanor had become with child, that she was approximately 4 months along, a condition that would have necessitated either marriage or considerable scandal, depending on how the situation was managed. This revelation, delivered with the delicate circumspection that Mrs. Hudson employed when discussing matters of moral consequence, shifted the entire framework through which the morning's tragedy ought to be understood. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the darkness, as if the night itself might reveal truths that daylight had obscured. If Eleanor had been pregnant with Christopher's child, the motivation for her death transformed from simple accident or impulsive act into something far more calculated and desperate. A young man facing the prospect of becoming a father out of wedlock, a family forced to confront scandal, a girl whose life was about to be irrevocably altered. These were circumstances that produced genuine desperation, the kind of desperation that sometimes manifested in violence. Yet even as this narrative seemed to assemble itself with apparent coherence, Miss Marple recognized the fundamental flaw in such reasoning. Christopher's defensive behavior, his absence from the gathering, the missing button from his waistcoat, these details aligned too perfectly with the narrative of guilt. She had learned through decades of observation that genuine guilt, when hidden, rarely presented such obvious signposts. It was more often the case that obvious suspects were guilty of other things entirely, that they had constructed elaborate deceptions to hide matters that bore no relation to the actual crime. She turned from the window and asked Mrs. Hudson a question that seemed, on its surface, tangential to the matter at hand. Had Mrs. Hudson ever observed Eleanor and Margaret Summers together, and had their friendship seemed genuinely affectionate, or had there been an undertone of something more complicated? Mrs. Hudson considered this carefully, her weathered face reflecting the complexity of her thoughts. She acknowledged that while the two girls had been inseparable since childhood, there had been moments when their interaction seemed strained, particularly in recent months. Margaret had seemed, Mrs. Hudson suggested, almost possessive of Eleanor, as if she feared losing her friend's attention. Indeed, Mrs. Hudson continued with growing certainty. She recalled witnessing a small incident at the market some weeks prior when Eleanor had spoken enthusiastically about an outing to London that Christopher had apparently suggested. Margaret had become quite upset, had suggested in rather sharp terms that Eleanor was being foolish, that certain attachments were dangerous and ought to be abandoned immediately. This observation crystallized something in Miss Marple's mind, though she maintained her outward composure as she thanked Mrs. Hudson for the conversation and excused herself to her bedroom for the evening. But sleep, when she attempted it, remained elusive. She lay in darkness, reconstructing the events of the afternoon, examining each interaction, each glance, each carefully measured word, with the precision of someone reading an ancient text in search of hidden meaning. By the time morning light began to creep through her bedroom window, Miss Marple had begun to suspect that the investigation being conducted by Inspector Blackwood was proceeding along a deliberately false path, and that Eleanor Weatherby's death, far from being the impulsive act of a desperate young man, was something far more calculated, conceived and executed by someone whose motivations ran deeper than love or fear of scandal, someone whose attachment to Eleanor had been so twisted, so distorted by jealousy and resentment, that only death could serve as adequate expression. The morning of Eleanor's death had transformed the village into a landscape of hushed speculation and barely concealed anxiety. News of the tragedy had spread through the community with the inevitable speed of water finding its level, and by the time Miss Marple emerged from her cottage shortly after 8 o'clock, the details had been elaborated upon, transformed, and reconstructed into narratives that bore only tangential relationship to actual events. She encountered this myth-making firsthand at the village post office, where Mrs. Thornton, the postmistress, was holding forth to a gathering of early morning customers about the various theories regarding Eleanor's death. Some suggested that she had slipped on the wet stones in a moment of carelessness, a tragedy born of nothing more than youthful inattention. Others, with more elaborate narratives, suggested that Eleanor had been contemplating something darker, that the mark on her wrist was self-inflicted in some mysterious way, that the button was merely a random object that had found its way into her hand during the drowning process. But the most persistent theory, the one that seemed to be gaining credence with each retelling, was that Christopher Weatherby, either in a fit of passion or in cold calculation, had confronted Eleanor by the pond, that an argument had ensued regarding their illicit attachment, and that in a moment of rage or desperation he had pushed her into the water, holding her beneath the surface until her struggles ceased. This narrative had the advantage of being dramatic, comprehensible, and conveniently focused on a suspect who had already demonstrated suspicious behavior. Miss Marple listened to these various accounts with her characteristic patience, interjecting occasional mild observations that seemed innocent, but which, had anyone possessed her depth of understanding, would have revealed the flaws in each theory. After departing the post office, She made her way toward the police station where she had learned that Inspector Blackwood would be conducting a second round of interviews. She did not arrive with any intention of providing information. Rather, she had come to observe, to note how the investigation was progressing, and to assess whether the inspector's mind was moving in directions that might prove productive, or whether he was, as she increasingly suspected, being deliberately guided toward conclusions that served someone's interest far better than they served the cause of justice. Inspector Blackwood greeted her with the courtesy that her age and reputation commanded, and he seemed, despite the weight of the investigation, somewhat pleased to see her. He confessed as they sat in his temporary office that the case was proving more complicated than initial appearances had suggested. While all evidence seemed to point toward Christopher Weatherby, the young man's statements, when examined carefully, contained certain inconsistencies that troubled the inspector's methodical mind. Christopher claimed to have been in the library reading throughout the relevant period, yet no one had actually seen him there, and when pressed about the specific book he claimed to have been reading, he had named a volume that was discovered, upon investigation, to be currently in the possession of Margaret Summers, who claimed she had borrowed it from the Weatherby Library 3 weeks prior. Furthermore, when confronted about the missing button from his waistcoat, Christopher had become remarkably calm, suggesting that the button must have been lost days earlier, that he had not noticed its absence, and that while it was undoubtedly his button, its presence in Eleanor's hand proved nothing regarding his involvement in her death. This response, delivered with a composure that seemed almost rehearsed, had struck the inspector as peculiar. A guilty man, Blackwood observed to Miss Marple, would typically become defensive or emotional when confronted with such direct evidence. Christopher's almost philosophical acceptance of the button's significance suggested either remarkable equanimity in the face of accusation or something considerably more troubling. The confidence of someone who understood that the button, while appearing to incriminate him, would ultimately lead the investigation in directions that served his interests. It was at this point that Miss Marple asked a question that caused Inspector Blackwood to lean back in his chair and regard her with renewed attention. She inquired whether anyone had examined the button with sufficient care to determine whether it had been deliberately placed in Eleanor's hand or whether it had simply become lodged there during the drowning process. Furthermore, she wondered aloud whether anyone had considered the possibility that the button had been placed in Eleanor's hand after her death, as a deliberate piece of misdirection designed to focus suspicion on a particular individual. The inspector's expression suggested that this possibility had not occurred to him, and that its implications were significant enough to warrant serious reconsideration of the entire investigation. Miss Marple continued with gentle precision that she had observed during her brief glimpse of Eleanor's body before the constables had secured the scene, that the button appeared to be gripped with remarkable firmness, as if the girl's fingers had curled around it, with intentional force. Yet the drowning process, in her limited understanding, generally resulted in the relaxation of muscles, not their contraction. This observation, combined with the positioning of Eleanor's body, which Dr. Hartwell had noted seemed indicative of struggle, suggested a narrative quite different from the one that seemed to be assembling itself so conveniently around Christopher Weatherby. Inspector Blackwood rose from his desk and began to pace, his substantial frame moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose entire understanding of a crime was shifting. He asked Miss Marple, with directness that reflected both respect and desperation, whether she possessed any specific knowledge regarding who might actually be responsible for Eleanor's death. Miss Marple, however, declined to offer such direct accusation. She suggested instead that a careful examination of Eleanor's interactions with others in the days before her death, a thorough investigation of the relationships that had bound her to her various acquaintances, and an honest assessment of who possessed both motive and opportunity might reveal answers that were currently obscured by the convenient narrative of a desperate young man's crime. Inspector Blackwood's investigation took on a new trajectory following Miss Marple's intervention, moving away from the convenient narrative of Christopher's guilt toward a more complex examination of Eleanor's relationships and the various motivations that had animated those around her. He dispatched constables to interview staff members at Thornfield Manor to examine Eleanor's personal correspondence and to construct a detailed account of her movements and associations during the weeks preceding her death. It was during this deeper investigation that a photograph emerged, a casual snapshot taken at a garden party approximately 2 months prior, showing Eleanor and Margaret Summers with their arms linked, their faces close together in the manner of intimate friends. Yet when examined more carefully, when enlarged and scrutinized with the attention that police work sometimes required, the photograph revealed something that the casual observer might overlook, but which Miss Marple, when shown the image by the inspector himself, recognized immediately. Eleanor's expression, captured in that frozen moment, was one of profound discomfort, while Margaret's face displayed an intensity of attachment that transcended ordinary friendship. The positioning of Margaret's hand, placed possessively around Eleanor's waist, suggested a depth of emotional investment that Eleanor herself clearly did not reciprocate. This discovery prompted a second, more thorough interview with Margaret Summers, conducted this time not as a sympathetic witness offering information about her closest friend, but as a potential suspect whose movements during the critical period required verification. Margaret's account of her whereabouts, when examined against the statements provided by other witnesses, began to demonstrate considerable inconsistency. She had initially claimed to have remained in the drawing room throughout the afternoon, yet 3 separate individuals now recalled seeing her near the garden path at times that corresponded precisely with Eleanor's movements. More significantly, when confronted with the photograph and the interpretation that might be placed upon her expression and positioning, Margaret became defensive in a manner that contrasted sharply with her initial composed demeanor. She insisted that her attachment to Eleanor had been nothing more than ordinary friendship, that she harbored no feelings beyond those appropriate to lifelong companions, yet her protestations carried a quality of desperation that suggested otherwise. It was during this second interview that Margaret made a critical error, one born of emotional distress rather than calculated deception. When asked directly whether she had known about Eleanor's relationship with Christopher, she responded with such immediate and visceral anger that the carefully constructed facade of innocent friendship shattered entirely. She had known, she admitted with venom that surprised even Inspector Blackwood, and she had warned Eleanor repeatedly that such an attachment was foolish, dangerous, and utterly unacceptable. Eleanor had refused to listen, had instead become increasingly absorbed in her relationship with Christopher, had begun to spend time away from the village, had even suggested, with breathtaking callousness according to Margaret's account, that their friendship might naturally evolve into something less central to her life as she devoted herself to romantic attachment. Margaret's account of this rejection, delivered with raw emotional pain barely concealed beneath layers of indignation, created the context within which Eleanor's death could be understood not as a random tragedy, but as the culmination of escalating emotional intensity. Yet even as this narrative began to assemble itself, Miss Marple recognized the fundamental question that remained unanswered. Had Margaret Summers possessed the physical capability and the emotional capacity to deliberately drown her lifelong friend? She was a slight girl, perhaps 5 feet 4 inches in height, weighing perhaps 115 pounds, considerably smaller than Eleanor, who had been robustly built and athletic. The mark on Eleanor's wrist suggested that someone with considerable strength had gripped the girl's arm, yet Margaret's own wrists appeared delicate, and her hands showed no sign of the physical strength required to restrain someone during drowning. This observation troubled Miss Marple deeply, for it suggested that while Margaret might possess motive, the jealousy of rejected love, the rage of abandonment, she likely lacked the physical capacity to have acted upon such motive alone. The inspector appeared to have reached similar conclusions, for although he continued to pursue inquiries into Margaret's movements and knowledge, he did not formally charge her with the crime. Instead, he expanded his investigation in other directions, requesting information about Eleanor's father, Richard, about Christopher's movements during the critical period, about whether anyone else possessed both knowledge of the relationship between Eleanor and Christopher and potential motive for preventing the scandal that would inevitably follow Eleanor's pregnancy. It was this expansion of inquiry that led, quite unexpectedly, to the discovery of a letter in Eleanor's bedroom, hidden beneath a loose floorboard and addressed to her mother. The letter, written in Eleanor's careful handwriting and dated just 2 days before her death, contained a confession of her pregnancy and a request for guidance regarding how to proceed. Yet, more significantly, the letter referenced a conversation Eleanor had apparently had with her father, in which Richard Weatherby had made remarks regarding the absolute impossibility of allowing such a scandal to attach itself to the family name. Remarks that Eleanor had interpreted as expressing profound anger and disappointment. It was this letter that transformed Richard Weatherby from peripheral figure into central suspect for a father's rage at his daughter's condition, combined with the physical strength to restrain a drowning victim, created a narrative that seemed to encompass both motive and means. Yet Miss Marple, upon learning of this development, experienced not satisfaction at the progression toward what appeared to be a likely perpetrator, but rather a deepening sense that the investigation was still proceeding along false paths, that hidden connections had not yet been revealed, and that the true architecture of Eleanor's murder remained obscured beneath layers of misdirection and emotional complexity that required far more careful examination than Inspector Blackwood's straightforward investigative methodology could provide. Richard Weatherby's interrogation by Inspector Blackwood took place in the formal study at Thornfield Manor, a room lined with leather-bound volumes that seemed to absorb sound and create an atmosphere of grave consequence. Richard was a man of 58 years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the deference that came with accumulated wealth. Yet his composure during this interrogation appeared considerably more fragile than his usual demeanor suggested. When confronted with the letter Eleanor had written to her mother, Richard's face underwent a transformation that spoke eloquently of shock and profound distress. He acknowledged reading the letter only after his wife had discovered it and brought it to his attention, and he admitted that his initial response had been one of considerable anger directed not at Eleanor herself, but at the circumstances that had placed his family in such a precarious position. However, when pressed regarding his specific movements during the afternoon of the garden party, Richard's account became increasingly vague and contradictory. He had been in his study reviewing financial matters, he suggested, though no one had actually observed him there. He had heard the commotion regarding Eleanor's death while seated in that same study, some distance from the gardens, and had only learned of the tragedy when his wife came to inform him of the disaster. This account was troubling precisely because it lacked corroboration, yet it was also troubling for reasons that suggested deeper complications. Miss Marple, observing this interrogation from a discreet distance, having been invited by Inspector Blackwood to attend as a consulting observer, noted that Richard's protestations of innocence carried a peculiar quality. He seemed not so much concerned with convincing the inspector of his non-involvement as preoccupied with something else entirely, something that caused his gaze to drift repeatedly toward the window and his fingers to work unconsciously at the buttons of his jacket. When the inspector pressed him directly regarding whether he had confronted Eleanor about her condition or her relationship with Christopher, Richard's response was carefully measured. He had intended, he admitted, to speak with Eleanor after the garden party concluded, to discuss the matter in private and to explore what options might be available to the family. He had not, however, had the opportunity to conduct such a conversation, as Eleanor had departed the drawing room before he could arrange a private meeting with her. This statement, delivered with apparent sincerity, nonetheless contained an element that troubled Miss Marple profoundly. Richard had known about Eleanor's movements, had apparently been tracking her location and activities with the watchfulness of someone preparing for a confrontation. When asked how he had become aware that Eleanor had left the drawing room, Richard hesitated, and in that hesitation, lay a revelation. His wife had informed him, he said finally, that Eleanor had excused herself to take a walk. Yet Constance Weatherby, when separately interviewed regarding this claim, denied having communicated any such information to her husband, stating instead that she had been engaged in conversation with guests throughout the critical period and had not noticed Eleanor's departure until Thomas Hardwick's alarmed announcement. This contradiction, seemingly minor, nonetheless suggested that Richard's account of his afternoon was considerably less truthful than his careful language implied. Inspector Blackwood, sensing the complexity of the situation and the inadequacy of direct interrogation to reveal truth in circumstances so laden with emotional complexity and family secrets, requested that Miss Marple join him in his makeshift office for a consultation. She arrived to find the inspector surrounded by documents, photographs, and the accumulated evidence of his investigation, looking considerably more troubled than his professional demeanor typically revealed. He confessed that while circumstantial evidence seemed to point increasingly toward Richard Weatherby, something in the logic of the crime remained unresolved. The physical evidence suggested that Eleanor had been held beneath the water with considerable force, yet Richard, while a robust man for his age, did not strike the inspector as possessing the kind of desperation or rage that typically motivated such an act. Moreover, the careful placement of the button in Eleanor's hand, the deliberate nature of the misdirection it represented, suggested a mind working with calculation rather than impulse. A father confronted with a daughter's moral transgression might act in anger, but would he then attempt such elaborate deception? Miss Marple posed a question that seemed to redirect the entire investigation. Had anyone examined whether Richard Weatherby had been alone during the critical period, or had someone else been in proximity to him, someone whose movements might have been obscured by his presence, someone who might have slipped away from the house while attention was focused on Richard's location? The inspector's expression suggested that this possibility had not been thoroughly explored, and he began immediately to make notes regarding the location of various family members and servants during the afternoon. It was then that Mrs. Hudson, Miss Marple's housekeeper, arrived at the police station with an urgent message. She had been reflecting on the events of the previous evening and had recalled something that she believed might be of significance. Christopher Weatherby had visited the library at Miss Marple's cottage approximately 3 weeks prior, ostensibly to borrow a particular volume of poetry for university studies. During this visit, which Mrs. Hudson had witnessed, Christopher had mentioned, in passing and with apparent casualness, that he had recently learned his father had been having financial difficulties, that his father's business ventures were failing, and that the family might soon face considerably reduced circumstances. This revelation, which Christopher had delivered with the kind of bitter resentment that suggested deeper emotional wounds, suddenly illuminated an entirely different motive and created the possibility that the crime had not been committed to prevent scandal, but rather for purposes considerably more material in nature, and that multiple members of the Weatherby household might have possessed knowledge of Eleanor's pregnancy and the potential complications it represented. The revelation regarding Richard Weatherby's financial difficulties transformed the entire scope of the investigation, introducing a dimension of material motivation that had previously remained obscured beneath the more emotionally charged narratives of romantic attachment and familial scandal. Inspector Blackwood, upon receiving this information, immediately dispatched inquiries to Richard's business associates and banking connections, seeking to establish the precise nature and extent of his financial predicament. What emerged from these investigations was a portrait of a man facing imminent financial ruin, a man whose investments in several commercial ventures had deteriorated significantly over the preceding 2 years, whose creditors were becoming increasingly insistent regarding outstanding debts, and whose personal finances were in a state of considerable disorder. More troubling still, Richard had apparently taken out substantial life insurance policies on both his children approximately 18 months prior, policies that would provide considerable financial relief to the family in the event of either Christopher's or Eleanor's death. This discovery, presented to Miss Marple during a consultation with Inspector Blackwood, created the framework for understanding Eleanor's death as potentially arising not from passionate confrontation or desperate prevention of scandal, but rather as a calculated act of financial necessity. Yet even as this narrative seemed to provide coherence to the crime, Miss Marple recognized that it raised as many questions as it answered. If Richard had deliberately murdered his daughter for the insurance proceeds, the elaborate deception regarding the button, the apparent targeting of Christopher for suspicion, suggested a level of premeditation and cunning that seemed inconsistent with the emotional reaction Richard had displayed when confronted with Eleanor's letter. Moreover, if Richard had been the perpetrator, how had he lured Eleanor to the pond? How had he managed to overpower her physically? And most significantly, how had he arranged the various misdirections that had so effectively confused the initial investigation? These questions led Miss Marple to propose a theory that caused even the seasoned inspector to regard her with a mixture of skepticism and reluctant acceptance. What if, she suggested, Eleanor's death had not been the act of a single individual, but rather the result of collusion between multiple family members, each of whom possessed both motive and knowledge of the other's involvement? What if Richard had known about Eleanor's pregnancy through his wife, had discussed with his wife the potential solutions to their financial difficulties, and had then enlisted his son Christopher in an elaborate scheme to prevent the scandal while simultaneously accessing the insurance proceeds that Eleanor's death would provide? This theory possessed the advantage of explaining the various inconsistencies in Christopher's behavior, his defensive responses when confronted with evidence, yet also his apparent composure regarding his potential guilt. It also explained why Richard's account of his movements had been so carefully vague, why he had seemed preoccupied with something beyond mere paternal anger, why he had mentioned tracking Eleanor's departure from the drawing room. Yet there remained a critical problem with this theory, a problem that Miss Marple herself acknowledged with characteristic intellectual honesty. If both Richard and Christopher had been involved in Eleanor's death, if they had coordinated their actions to create the impression of accident or isolated guilt, then who had actually held Eleanor beneath the water? Who possessed the physical strength and the proximity to accomplish such an act? It was this question that led Inspector Blackwood to expand his investigation once more, this time focusing on the servants and household staff at Thornfield Manor. It was during this examination of peripheral figures that a critical detail emerged. Thomas Hardwick, the gardener's apprentice who had discovered Eleanor's body, possessed considerably more physical strength than his youthful appearance suggested. He was, according to the gardener himself, capable of strenuous labor and possessed the kind of robust constitution that came from years of physical work. Moreover, Thomas had apparently harbored romantic feelings for Eleanor, feelings that were entirely unrequited, directed toward a young woman who moved in circles considerably elevated above his own social station. This unrequited attachment, combined with certain remarks Thomas had apparently made to fellow servants regarding the unfairness of Eleanor's relationship with Christopher, created the possibility that Thomas might have been manipulated or coerced into participating in Eleanor's death. When confronted with this possibility and with evidence of his deeper feelings for Eleanor, Thomas initially denied any involvement. Yet, as the interrogation progressed, as Inspector Blackwood presented the various pieces of evidence that seemed to converge upon the conclusion of his participation in the crime, Thomas's composure began to fracture. He had been approached, he finally admitted, by Richard Weatherby approximately 1 week before Eleanor's death. Richard had mentioned, in careful terms that suggested genuine distress, that Eleanor was in considerable danger, not physical danger, but moral and spiritual danger. She was involved in a relationship that would destroy her life and bring shame to her family, Richard had suggested. He had implied, though never stated directly, that if Eleanor's life were to end before she could consummate this ruinous attachment, a considerable sum of money would be available as reward for whoever might be willing to prevent such a catastrophe. Thomas had understood perfectly well the implications of such a proposal. He had been horrified, he insisted, had rejected the suggestion immediately. Yet Richard had persisted, had pointed out Thomas's lack of prospects, had suggested that with sufficient financial resources, Thomas might be able to establish himself in a better position, might eventually become someone worthy of consideration by a woman of Eleanor's social standing. It was this appeal to Thomas's own romantic aspirations, combined with what the young man characterized as Richard's emotional manipulation, that had gradually eroded his resistance. Thomas had eventually agreed, though he claimed he had believed the plan was merely to frighten Eleanor, to demonstrate to her the dangers of her current path. He had not understood, he insisted with growing desperation, that Richard actually intended for Eleanor to die. Yet when confronted with the physical evidence, the mark on Eleanor's wrist that matched the dimensions of Thomas's hands, the button that had been deliberately planted as misdirection, Thomas finally confessed. He had met Eleanor by the pond on Richard's instructions, had told her that Christopher had sent him with a message. When Eleanor had turned to follow him, he had gripped her arm, had attempted to pull her away from the water's edge. But Eleanor had struggled, had cried out, and in the confusion that followed, Thomas had panicked. Richard Weatherby, who had apparently been observing from a distance, had suddenly emerged, and together, in a moment of coordinated violence, they had held Eleanor beneath the water until her struggles ceased. Thomas Hardwick's confession, delivered with the halting reluctance of a young man confronting the enormity of his own culpability, created a fracture in the carefully constructed facade that had protected Richard Weatherby from direct accusation. Within hours of Thomas's statement being formally recorded, Inspector Blackwood obtained a warrant to search Richard's study, where evidence of his financial desperation and his communications with Thomas were discovered in the form of letters and financial documents that revealed the deliberate nature of his manipulation. Yet even as the investigation seemed to be approaching its conclusion, Miss Marple recognized that something remained fundamentally incomplete about the narrative that was assembling itself. She requested a final meeting with Inspector Blackwood before he proceeded with formal charges, and during this consultation she posed a series of questions that revealed the complexity of the crime in ways that Thomas's confession, taken at face value, failed to adequately address. She asked, first, whether Thomas had been acting entirely of his own volition when he had agreed to meet Eleanor by the pond, or whether someone else had been involved in directing his movements. She asked, secondly, why Christopher Weatherby, if he had not been directly involved in the crime, had nonetheless demonstrated such remarkable composure throughout the investigation, such apparent lack of genuine surprise at the developing revelations. Most significantly, she asked whether anyone had examined the precise timing of events on the afternoon of Eleanor's death, with sufficient care to determine whether the sequence of events that Thomas had described actually aligned with the physical evidence and the various witness statements. These questions, delivered with Miss Marple's characteristic gentleness, nonetheless cut to the heart of critical inconsistencies that closer examination would inevitably reveal. Inspector Blackwood, troubled by these observations, requested that Thomas be brought back for additional questioning, this time focusing on the precise sequence of events and the identities of all individuals present during Eleanor's death. It was during this second interrogation that Thomas, apparently having consulted with the solicitor and reconsidered the wisdom of accepting full responsibility for a crime in which his own agency had been so thoroughly compromised, began to provide additional details that implicated others more directly. He had not, he insisted, held Eleanor beneath the water with the deliberate intent to drown her. He had merely gripped her arm, had allowed Richard to take control of the situation. But then, to his horror and shock, Christopher had appeared at the pond's edge. Christopher had taken one look at the scene, his father restraining Eleanor in the shallow water, Thomas standing frozen in uncertainty, and rather than attempting to prevent the crime, Christopher had stepped forward and had assisted his father in holding Eleanor beneath the surface. This revelation transformed Christopher from potential suspect into actual perpetrator, an accomplice to his sister's murder, and opened questions regarding his own motivations and the extent to which he had been involved in planning the crime from its inception. When confronted with this accusation, Christopher's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. He admitted, with the bitter rage of a young man whose life had been irrevocably compromised by circumstances beyond his control, that he had known about the plan to prevent Eleanor's scandal through her death. His father had approached him, had explained the financial necessity, had suggested that Eleanor's death would solve multiple problems simultaneously. It would prevent the scandal that would attach itself to the family. It would provide the insurance proceeds necessary to rescue the family from financial ruin, and it would eliminate the complication that Eleanor's child would have represented. Christopher had initially rejected the proposal with horror, had insisted that such a thing was impossible, unthinkable. Yet his father had been persistent, had pointed out that Christopher's own prospects, his education, his future comfort all depended on the family's financial stability. He had suggested that Christopher bore some responsibility for Eleanor's condition, that if Christopher had not involved himself in such an inappropriate attachment, none of this would have been necessary. Slowly, through a process of emotional manipulation and financial argument, Richard had eroded Christopher's resistance until the young man had agreed not merely to remain silent about the plan, but to actively participate in its execution. When the moment had come, when Thomas had attempted to restrain Eleanor and Richard had emerged from his hiding place, Christopher had acted with the kind of emotional detachment that suggested a mind fractured by the conflict between filial loyalty and moral revulsion. He had helped to hold his sister beneath the water, had participated in her death, and had then assisted in the elaborate deception that had followed, including the deliberate placement of the button in Eleanor's hand as a means of directing suspicion toward himself. A sacrifice born of the twisted logic that suggested his confession and imprisonment would somehow make amends for his participation in his sister's murder. The revelation of Christopher's involvement created a profound shock that reverberated through the village with the force of an earthquake. The Weatherby family, apparently united in respectability and social standing, had been revealed as a collective instrument of calculated murder, each member participating according to their own particular role and motivation. Constance Weatherby, Eleanor's mother, had apparently known of the plan and had chosen not to prevent it, a complicity born of her own desperation regarding the family's financial circumstances and her unwillingness to confront her husband's moral degradation. She had occupied herself during the afternoon of the garden party with careful inattention, had avoided witnessing the crime directly, yet her knowledge of its occurrence made her, in the eyes of the law, an accessory to murder. By the time formal charges were filed and the members of the Weatherby household were taken into custody, the village had been transformed from a place of apparent peace and respectability into a landscape of profound moral disquiet. The crime had revealed the fragility of social facades, the ways that financial desperation could corrupt even familial bonds, and the terrible capacity of human beings to rationalize participation in evil through the mechanisms of emotional manipulation and self-deception. Miss Marple, observing the aftermath of the investigation's conclusion, reflected that Eleanor's death was perhaps not unusual at all in its fundamental elements. It was merely another variation on the themes of human weakness and moral compromise that she had observed countless times throughout her long life in St. Mary Mead. The trial of Richard, Christopher, and Thomas Hardwick took place in the county courthouse during the autumn session, drawing considerable public attention and media scrutiny that transformed the quiet village tragedy into a matter of national interest. The proceedings revealed in meticulous detail the architecture of the crime and the psychological dynamics that had enabled otherwise ordinary people to participate in murder. Richard Weatherby's defense counsel argued that his client had acted under extreme duress, that his financial circumstances had driven him to desperation, that he had not anticipated the full consequences of his actions. Yet this argument, while potentially generating sympathy in some quarters, failed to mitigate the fundamental fact of his deliberate participation in his daughter's death. Christopher's defense was considerably more complex, built upon the assertion that he had been emotionally manipulated by his father, that he lacked the moral agency to resist his parents' influence, that his participation in the actual crime had been minimal compared to his father's leadership. These arguments resonated somewhat with the jury, for there existed genuine sympathy for a young man apparently trapped between filial obligation and moral conscience. Thomas Hardwick, represented by a public solicitor of considerable competence, presented himself as the most sympathetic figure, a working-class youth of limited education who had been deliberately exploited by a man of superior social standing and financial resources. His culpability was undeniable, yet the circumstances of his manipulation created a certain degree of moral ambiguity that affected even the most severe observers. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which time Miss Marple attended the proceedings with the kind of quiet attention that she brought to all significant events. She sat in the public gallery, her knitting needles working steadily as witnesses testified, as evidence was presented, as the various legal arguments unfolded with the ritualistic precision that characterized the English judicial system. It was during the testimony of Margaret Summers that an unexpected complication emerged. Margaret, called to testify regarding Eleanor's state of mind in the weeks preceding her death, broke down on the witness stand when describing the various conversations she and Eleanor had conducted regarding Eleanor's relationship with Christopher. Under gentle questioning from the prosecutor, Margaret revealed that Eleanor had confided in her regarding her pregnancy approximately 1 week before her death. Eleanor had expressed considerable anxiety regarding how her parents would react, had admitted that she feared her father's anger, and had even mentioned in passing that her father had made certain remarks suggesting that he viewed her condition as a source of shame that might require drastic action to remedy. This testimony, which suggested that Eleanor had possessed some awareness of her father's potential dangerousness, created a poignant image of a young woman apparently recognizing the threat she faced, yet lacking the courage or resources to escape it. Margaret's emotional breakdown on the witness stand was genuine and profound, reflecting the depths of her grief and the complex mixture of emotions she harbored regarding Eleanor's death. As she was led from the courtroom, she paused briefly beside Miss Marple's seat, and their eyes met with a recognition that transcended the formal proceedings. Miss Marple perceived in that glance a young woman confronting the reality that her possessive attachment to Eleanor, her jealousy of Eleanor's relationship with Christopher, had in some profound way contributed to the circumstances that had resulted in Eleanor's death. This realization, though it did not alter legal responsibility, nonetheless created a moral complexity that extended far beyond the individuals actually charged with the crime. The verdicts, when finally delivered after the jury's 3-day deliberation, reflected the various degrees of culpability and moral ambiguity that the trial had revealed. Richard Weatherby was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence that acknowledged the deliberate nature of his crime while stopping short of the ultimate penalty. Christopher Weatherby was found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that reflected the jury's assessment that while he had participated in his sister's death, the degree of his moral agency and voluntary participation remained diminished by familial pressure and emotional manipulation. He received a sentence of 20 years imprisonment, a considerably lighter punishment than his father's, yet one that would nonetheless consume the majority of his youth and young adulthood. Thomas Hardwick was similarly convicted of manslaughter and received a sentence of 18 years, the slight reduction from Christopher's sentence reflecting the jury's recognition that Thomas had been the least culpable of the three, the most thoroughly manipulated, the least capable of resisting the influence brought to bear upon him. Constance Weatherby, Eleanor's mother, was charged with being an accessory after the fact, a charge that acknowledged her knowledge of the crime and her failure to prevent or report it. She received a sentence of 5 years' imprisonment, and in many ways this punishment seemed to the community to be the most devastating of all. A woman who had sacrificed her daughter to preserve her family's financial security, now facing the destruction of her marriage, the imprisonment of her husband and remaining son, and the permanent alienation of her surviving family members. The village's reaction to the trial's conclusion was complex and multifaceted. Some residents experienced satisfaction that justice had been served, that the individuals responsible for Eleanor's death had been appropriately punished. Others felt profound disquiet regarding the broader implications of the crime. The revelation that apparent respectability concealed depths of moral corruption, that financial desperation could motivate even the most terrible crimes, that familial bonds could be twisted to serve the purposes of evil. The cottage where Eleanor had grown up remained closed, its windows dark, its gardens untended, a physical monument to the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. The manor gradually fell into disrepair as the various family properties were disposed of to pay debts and legal fees. Mrs. Weatherby's sisters attempted to maintain some family connection, but the stigma of the crime proved too profound to overcome, and gradually the Weatherby name became associated primarily with the murder that had dominated the news for several months and then, as is the way of such things, faded into the background of public consciousness as newer scandals and tragedies captured attention. 6 months after the conclusion of the trial, the village had begun its gradual return to the rhythms of ordinary life, though an undercurrent of unease persisted beneath the surface of daily interactions. The scandal had fundamentally altered the social landscape, creating divisions that would persist for years to come. Some residents had interpreted the Weatherby tragedy as a cautionary tale regarding the dangers of excessive materialism and the corruption that financial desperation could introduce into even the most respectable families. Others had focused their judgment more narrowly on the individuals involved, drawing a protective circle around their own families and speaking with certainty about their own imperviousness to such moral degradation. Miss Marple observed these various reactions with her characteristic patience, understanding that human beings possessed a remarkable capacity for self-deception, for constructing narratives that absolved them of complicity, while condemning others for similar failings. She had returned to her cottage, had resumed her quiet life of gardening and needlework, had begun to fade back into the background of village society, becoming once again merely an elderly woman whose observations were noted politely, but not given particular weight. Yet the investigation and trial had revealed to her something profound about the nature of crime and human motivation that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Eleanor's death. She understood that the tragedy had not emerged spontaneously from Richard Weatherby's desperation, but had developed gradually through the accumulation of small moral compromises, each one seemingly justifiable in isolation, each one making the next compromise more acceptable, until finally the unthinkable had become not merely thinkable, but executable. It was during this period of reflection that Miss Marple received a visitor who arrived at her cottage on a grey November afternoon, carrying with her the kind of emotional burden that was immediately apparent to anyone possessing Miss Marple's perceptiveness. Margaret Summers had aged noticeably since Eleanor's death, her youthful features now marked by lines of grief and psychological torment that suggested she had spent the intervening months in profound emotional distress. She had come, she explained after the initial pleasantries had been exchanged and tea had been prepared, because she needed to speak with someone who might understand the complexity of her feelings and the questions that continued to torment her regarding her own culpability in Eleanor's death. She had loved Eleanor, Margaret insisted, with an intensity that she now recognized might have crossed the boundaries of appropriate friendship into something more possessive and controlling. She'd warned Eleanor repeatedly regarding her relationship with Christopher, yet these warnings had been motivated not purely by concern for Eleanor's well-being, but by Margaret's own jealousy and her fear of losing Eleanor's attention and affection. Had her possessiveness, Margaret asked with desperate urgency, contributed to the circumstances that had resulted in Eleanor's death? Had her attempts to control Eleanor's relationship somehow created the emotional atmosphere within which Eleanor's murder had become possible? Miss Marple listened to this confession with the kind of profound attention that she brought to all matters of genuine human distress. She recognized in Margaret's anguish a young woman grappling with the complex realities of moral complicity. The recognition that one's own actions and motivations, however understandable and human, could have consequences that extended far beyond what one had anticipated or desired. She responded not with absolution, which would have been dishonest, nor with condemnation, which would have served no constructive purpose. Instead, she attempted to help Margaret understand the distinction between moral responsibility and causal responsibility, between the complexity of human motivation and the specific choices that individuals made regarding their actions. Margaret's possessiveness, Miss Marple suggested gently, had not caused Richard Weatherby to murder his daughter. It had not influenced Christopher to participate in that murder. It had not driven Thomas Hardwick to become an instrument of that murder. What Margaret's possessiveness had perhaps done was to contribute to Eleanor's emotional vulnerability, to the isolation that the young woman had felt as her closest friend attempted to prevent her from exploring other relationships. This vulnerability might have made Eleanor less able to recognize the dangers she faced from her father, might have left her with fewer emotional resources to resist his manipulation or to seek external assistance. Yet this recognition, while important, did not fundamentally alter the fact that Eleanor's death was the result of choices made by specific individuals, Richard, Christopher, and Thomas, who possessed agency and moral responsibility for their own actions. Margaret departed the cottage somewhat less tormented than she had arrived, though Miss Marple recognized that the young woman would require considerably more than a single afternoon of conversation to work through the emotional complexities that Eleanor's death had introduced into her life. Yet she had taken the first step toward understanding that she could acknowledge her own emotional failings, without accepting responsibility for crimes she had not committed. In the weeks that followed this conversation, Miss Marple found herself reflecting increasingly on the nature of human connection and the ways that love, in all its various manifestations, could become twisted and corrupted by the introduction of possessiveness, jealousy, and the desire to control others. She understood that the village's apparent peace was built upon a foundation of collective denial, that many residents had simply chosen not to examine too closely the ways that their own behavior might have contributed to the conditions under which Eleanor's murder had become possible. The gardener who had turned a blind eye to his apprentice's absence on the afternoon of the crime. The servants who had observed peculiar interactions between various family members yet had remained silent. The neighbors who had heard fragments of conversation suggesting emotional turmoil within the Weatherby household, yet had concluded it was not their place to interfere. All of these individuals bore some share of moral responsibility for the tragedy, though none of them would likely ever acknowledge this fact to themselves or to others. It was on a cold December morning, precisely 1 year after Eleanor Weatherby's death, that Miss Marple found herself sitting in her familiar wicker chair beneath the stone pergola at Thornfield Manor. The garden had been transformed during the intervening months. The elaborate flower beds that Constance Weatherby had once maintained with such meticulous care had been allowed to fall into neglect, creating a landscape that seemed to mirror the moral decay that had characterized the family's hidden life. The new owners of the manor, a retired couple from London who possessed no knowledge of the tragedy that had occurred within these walls, had begun the process of restoration, yet their efforts seemed somehow insufficient to cleanse the property of the darkness that had settled upon it. Inspector Blackwood had invited Miss Marple to revisit the scene of the crime as part of his preparation for a comprehensive written account of the investigation that he intended to submit to Scotland Yard as a case study in the complexities of family murder. As they walked together through the gardens, retracing the path that Eleanor had taken on that final afternoon, The inspector reflected on the investigation with the kind of retrospective analysis that came only after considerable time had passed and emotions had begun to settle into more manageable proportions. He acknowledged to Miss Marple, with a candor born of mutual respect and professional regard, that without her insights and observations, the investigation would likely have concluded with an innocent man imprisoned and the actual perpetrators still at large. He confessed that his initial instinct had been to pursue Christopher with single-minded determination, that he had been prepared to construct a narrative of guilt around the young man, based on circumstantial evidence and convenient assumptions. It was only through Miss Marple's gentle redirection of his investigative focus that he had been enabled to perceive the deeper complexities that underlay the apparently straightforward facts of the crime. Miss Marple accepted this acknowledgment with characteristic graciousness, suggesting that the inspector's eventual recognition of the crime's true nature reflected credit upon his professional judgment and his willingness to question his own initial conclusions. She noted that many investigators would have been satisfied with a solution that fit the available evidence and allowed for the closure that the public desired. The inspector's persistence in pursuing truth rather than mere convenience spoke well of his commitment to justice, even when that commitment required admitting the inadequacy of his own preliminary conclusions. They stood together at the edge of the pond, where the willow arch still arched gracefully over the water, indifferent to the tragedy that had occurred beneath its branches. The pond itself seemed remarkably unchanged, its surface reflecting the gray December sky with perfect clarity, giving no indication of the violence that had occurred within its waters. Miss Marple attempted to articulate something that had troubled her throughout the entire investigation and trial, something that extended beyond the specific facts of Eleanor's death to encompass broader questions about human nature and the circumstances that motivated crime. She suggested that Eleanor's tragedy was not truly unique, that variations of such murders occurred regularly throughout the country, motivated by financial desperation, family shame, or the desire to escape the consequences of one's own moral failings. What made Eleanor's case distinctive was not the crime itself, but rather the constellation of individuals whose various motivations and failures of moral courage had converged to make that crime possible. If Richard had possessed sufficient financial discipline, if Christopher had possessed sufficient moral courage, if Thomas had possessed sufficient self-awareness to recognize his own vulnerability to manipulation, if the various family members and servants had possessed sufficient vigilance regarding suspicious behavior, Eleanor might well have survived to become a woman of 30, 40, 60 years of age. Instead, the accumulation of human weakness and moral compromise had resulted in her death before she had lived a quarter-century. The inspector suggested that this observation, while philosophically interesting, provided limited comfort to the families and communities affected by such crimes. Miss Marple agreed, acknowledging that understanding the causes of crime did not prevent that crime from occurring, nor did it restore to life those who had been murdered. Yet she suggested that if society could learn to recognize the patterns of moral compromise that preceded violent crime, if individuals could develop sufficient courage to intervene when they observed such patterns developing within their own communities, perhaps some future tragedies might be prevented. It was this conviction that had motivated her decades of careful observation, her willingness to involve herself in the solving of mysteries that official investigators might otherwise have mishandled. She had learned through long experience that the most valuable weapon against crime was not forensic science or investigative technique, though these possessed their uses, but rather a comprehensive understanding of human nature and the willingness to look beyond obvious appearances toward deeper truth. As the afternoon light began to fade and the two visitors prepared to depart from Thornfield Manor, the inspector posed a final question regarding whether Miss Marple believed that justice had been adequately served by the trial's outcome. Miss Marple considered this question with the kind of philosophical depth that characterized her approach to life's most significant matters. She suggested that justice, in its truest sense, was a concept that transcended legal verdicts and prison sentences. Richard Weatherby would spend the remainder of his life imprisoned for his crime. Yet this imprisonment did not restore Eleanor to life or undo the trauma inflicted upon the various individuals who had loved her. Christopher would emerge from prison years hence, his youth consumed by the consequences of his moral failure. Yet his imprisonment did not resolve the fundamental question of how human beings could be educated to resist manipulation and to maintain moral courage in the face of familial pressure. Thomas Hardwick would eventually be released, would attempt to construct some semblance of a life from the fragments of his former existence. Yet his imprisonment did nothing to address the societal conditions that had left him vulnerable to exploitation by a man of superior social standing. True justice, Miss Marple suggested, would have consisted of the prevention of Eleanor's death through the intervention of individuals who might have recognized the danger and possessed the courage to act. Since such prevention had not occurred, the legal proceedings that had followed represented merely an imperfect attempt to restore balance to a fundamentally disordered situation. Yet imperfect justice was infinitely superior to no justice at all. The trial had at least provided a public acknowledgement of Eleanor's death as a wrong that demanded accountability rather than as a tragedy to be mourned and then forgotten.